The lights in your house aren't as bright as the sun might be, but compared with lights in other houses, they might be incredibly bright indeed. It's easy to become incredibly disheartened about the state of the Western world, and the reason why it's so easy to become so disheartened about it is because we are constantly bombarded with news of its faults and of new horrors which are being introduced, which could somehow collapse the entire system. And perhaps those new horrors will collapse the entire system, and perhaps the horrors which we currently experience are extreme. There's nothing which is not terrible about them. But when you look at what's being experienced in the Western world, and then you look at what's being experienced in China or Africa or any other part of the world, the Western world and its counterparts are, in fact, much better off than the rest of the world. It's much better to live in Europe or even Eastern Europe or Russia or America or Australia than it would be to live in, for instance, China. We might complain about a sort of social credit system emerging in the West, given that a certain amount of people are denied credit from banks. And the people who are denied credit these days or denied banking accounts are often denied for strange reasons. Although in the past there has been denial of credit for more valid reasons, such as suspected terrorism or so forth, which is the reason why banks have a right and a duty to exclude people from their services at times, though redefinition of terms is a big problem in the West, and often one side or the other will redefine the politics of the day to deem their opponents in the political realm to be something that they aren't, and to label them in the media or so forth with such unfortunate labels, intentionally so, given that certain media are often owned by certain companies which benefit in certain ways from a certain type of politics taking place, such as a politics which allows more of their products to be bought by the government, or certain wars to be entered into which are beneficial to them, or for certain medical supplies to be purchased. And lobbying is a well-known thing, and it's often quite well registered which companies have which lobbies in which places in the Western world. But look at the censorship in the Western world, where you can still understand that there's censorship going on, and that you can get around it and understand what's happening, that you can go to different sources, that you can still go to Gab or BitChute or whatever else it is. And then look at the censorship in a place like China, which is much more thorough. You might say that the Western world is losing a lot of its core values and think, well, if only we were like the Muslim world, the Arab world. But you look at the statistics of the Arab world, and it's not necessarily much better off. In fact, while it might be confused that Islam is simply a more thorough version of Christianity or Catholicism, whatever, with more emphasis on doing things, you look at the fasting which takes place, and quite often people have health problems from it because they eat a lot more than usual in a day by eating only before sunset and after before sunrise and after sunset, which is not healthy for them, and they overcompensate for the fact that they're fasting. So it's not healthy, it's not good. And if you look instead at the more moderate type of fasting, which is often done during Lent, it often is less food which is consumed, and it can have a beneficial effect on health. And if you look at the Ten Commandments, Islam, when Moses comes down from the mountain, you don't have a Ten Commandments there. And at times, Muslims see it as right to lie because Muhammad lied in certain contexts. And there's a whole lot of different instances of morality. It's just a simply different moral system. It emphasizes religiosity and ceremony very much. And it emphasizes dressing in certain ways very much. But it's simply a alternative religion to the Western types of religions which we have. It's not a superiority. And if you look at it from the outside, you might not see what people on the inside of it see, which is simply their own religion and their own way of life. China, for instance, has a lot of lawlessness in many of its villages and areas. You might say the Chinese are so tough on drugs, there's no drug problem. And yet, if you look at footage of people driving through Chinese villages, often people openly sell drugs, including drugs which are used for very bad crimes against people to render them unable to move. And you might say, oh, this or that other thing doesn't happen in this place because they're very harsh on it and they have a death penalty. And yet there's a lot of lawlessness in a lot of these countries which are very authoritarian. You might have an authoritarianism similar to Rome when it comes to criticizing the authority or the party, but you don't really have the same level of legal enforcement as in Western countries quite often. And you often don't have the level of maintenance of things, which comes from the Western desire for there to be individual property rights. If there's individual property rights, you might see that people in your neighborhood, and I see this in my neighborhood, people go out with their lawnmowers and mow the grass, which is the common grass on the green, or which is outside of their houses and so forth, even though it's not theirs. They do it because they own their houses and they want their house values to be good. But in a place like China, you might not have so much maintenance or unpaid work which people do in order to simply make things pleasant for them and for their neighborhoods. And this goes for a lot of other things. For instance, in the West, you might be forced to use a person's pronouns or something like that, even if you don't believe that they are what they say they are. But in many parts of the world, if you don't refer to someone as His Excellency, or if you don't pay great homage to things you don't necessarily believe in, you can be in a lot of trouble. If you don't believe the official religion, you can be executed or dealt with in other ways, which are quite harsh. And so the Western world is not the sun. It's not this bright, bright light. It's simply a light which has some brightness to it. And while there have been attempts to say, why is the West so successful? Is it because of the intelligence of the people in the Western world? Well, the intelligence of people in the Western world is, according to IQ tests, lower than the intelligence of people in parts of Asia who have less prosperity and less happiness. It is higher than other parts of the world. Is it because of natural resources? Well, the Western world doesn't have too many of those compared to many parts of the world which are very much less successful. What does make the West so successful? And you can say property rights to a degree, and you can say respect of property rights and human rights, all sorts of things. Though you recently had a vote to take away landlords' property in Germany, in Berlin. And after World War II, when the courts ruled against the British government, they decided to expropriate some property to reverse a court decision. So the Western world has a respect for property. It has a culture for it. But a lot of what the West has is, in addition to what it should have based on the things it does and has and its resources and its people, a lot of what the Western world have is something which might be called grace, something for which we should be grateful for, because we have a prosperity in the West which is not necessarily everywhere else in the world, and we have it despite the fact that we often make a lot of mistakes. And that's something which we need gratitude for, gratitude to our ancestors, gratitude to God, gratitude to all of these different factors which have favored us, and an awareness that we are here but by the grace of God. And yet, for now, thanks to God and thanks to our luck and fortunateness in this world, and our respect for property rights, and the history of our culture was created by Christianity, we have something in there. We have something which is worth a lot and which we shouldn't go out of our way to lose. And gratitude, I think, is also an important thing to have in the West, and which helps the West quite a lot as a culture, as a loose culture of different nations. Our gratitude is important to our history. The houses we live in are often very old houses, which were built by people a long time ago. If we were to take the approach of many people in communist China and just demolish those houses and build new modern houses, we wouldn't necessarily be able to build upon the wealth of our ancestors. We'd simply be putting that money into building new houses in the place of them. So a respect for the past has been very beneficial to us. And yet, again, that's not enough to explain the difference between the Western world and the rest of the world. We have some degree of authoritarianism, especially associated with a fear of disease, which is natural in human beings. Humans become more authoritarian when there's disease. And yet, we still have a degree of freedom which is not available elsewhere in the world. You might have speech limits in parts of the world like Britain, and yet those speech limits are not as bad as they are in many other parts of the world. We in the West are incredibly fortunate, and we should be deeply grateful for our civilization and for our governments and for our peoples, even if things may look very bad. What we see is a comparison of our light to the sun, when in fact we should be looking at the other lights out there and saying, they have light, and that's good, and we have light, and that's good. But the light which we have in the West is one which is one of the brighter lights in the world, and we should be grateful for that, and we are fortunate for that.